Afternoon, RVAsec. My name's David Bianco. As you can probably tell, I work for a company, FireEye. What I want to talk to you today really is not that much related. This is not a product or anything that we sell. It's something that I've been working on the last several years, even before I came to FireEye. I've been thinking about the problem of how we can do better at finding evil and figuring out what to do about it when we found it. I'm a very loud talker. Let's see if I can move this down a little bit here. There. Can you guys still hear me? All right. So anyway, I've been trying to think about the problem of how to find evil better, how to figure out what to do about it once we have found it. Before I came to FireEye, I spent the last about 5 years at a Fortune 5 company, helping to figure out all this detection and response things for all of our operations everywhere in the world. And one thing that I noticed was that we were really dependent upon threat intelligence. But there was not what I would call a widespread or possibly even at all spread understanding of what intelligence really was, let alone how you could use it intelligently to further your goals of finding evil and doing something about it. So what I want to talk to you guys today is one approach that I came up with that I think can really help us out. I call it the pyramid of pain. And just to give you the teaser of what's going to come by the end of the presentation, the idea of it is to use the things that you know in the most effective way to kind of turn your defensive detection and defensive response operations into an offensive weapon that can really cause some pain for the people who are trying to attack your network. But before we talk about that, though, I'd like to talk a little bit about intelligence in general. So first of all, raise your hand in here if you're doing some kind of threat intelligence in your environment. Okay, some people. Now keep your hands up. Go ahead, keep them up. Now, if you think that you're doing great with your use of threat intelligence, take your hands down. I didn't see very many hands move, maybe a few. So what that tells me is that there's some people that are using threat intel, but they feel even they may be getting some value out of it, they have some room for improvement. I would agree with that for most cases. The most common way that I see people use threat intelligence is what I call the wacky wall walker approach. Take everything you got and throw it against the wall, and let's see what sticks. And it trickles down until it gets to the floor, and it looks like a kind of little sad, amorphous blob. The good thing about that is, hey, you can put all your intelligence on your sensors everywhere. It's very easy to implement. Super easy to explain what you're doing to people. Hey, well, we know all these things. Let's throw them on all of our sensors. Unfortunately, there's some big downsides to that approach, too. It's kind of the naive approach. First of all, you get a lot of alerts based on your 3,000 host names and IP addresses and whatever you have in there. It's way too many for a typical SOC to handle. You also know confidence in those alerts. It's kind of a direct follow-on. You have so many of them, they're mostly junk, therefore when you do get one, you just don't give a crap. Eventually, you start just saying, this is nothing, false positives, nothing, and then eventually you're just like, I don't even bother to look at these because every time that I've done it in the past 3 months, it's been nothing. So therefore, everything in the future forever is going to be nothing. So I won't even bother to look at it. To me, maybe the worst part of the whole thing is people you're trying to use that threat intelligence against, they're probably laughing at you. They're like, they don't know what they're doing. But fortunately, there is a better way, I think. I've been speaking for the last year or so on this thing that I call enterprise security monitoring. I totally ripped off the name from Richard Balick. his network security monitoring that he helped popularize, where you take a lot of network security kind of data, put it together so it can provide context for the other pieces of data you're collecting, and provide some analysis tools. Well, I've kind of said, well, that's great, and I have been a proponent of network security monitoring for about 10 years, and I love it to death. But it's not everything, because it's only the network side. So in my approach, I take all the data that I can find in the network that I think would be useful for detection and response kind of things. So we have all the technical data, so like HTTP server logs or proxy logs or FTP logs or whatever. But you also have like firewall logs, logs by your network infrastructure, switches, routers, whatever. Any of your host or endpoint stuff, if you have antivirus or HIPS products or whitelisting products or anything like that. Certainly all of the things that you have that generate alerts, intrusion detection systems or NSM systems or anything like that, data loss prevention, and then all of your operating systems and application logs and things like that. Bring them all into one place. But also combine them with other things that you might have that I call like business data. So org chart kind of info, so you can see, well, I got a login name here, but I don't really know where in the organization he sits, where you can kind of correlate them to find out, well, this is a finance user. It helps give you a little bit of extra context. Also employee databases or travel or anything like that. So bring all of the things, hey, these are the list of terminated employees for the last 3 months. We better check to see if we're still using any of their accounts. Okay. Bring all that stuff ultimately up here into one place where you can aggregate it and do some kind of alerting and hunting and things like that. But the key for today's talk is it all filters through this layer of the threat intelligence. Everything that you know to look for, all this data is coming up through that layer. So let's talk about how that looks in terms of your daily operation. I kind of break down the business of finding evil and doing something about it. That sounds like it should be 2 things. It's actually 3. Because before you can find evil, you have to figure out what kind of evil you want to find and what you know about that evil. So we start up here with the intelligence. And that could be in a large organization. You might have an intel group that is dedicated, and you might have some actual intel analysts, and they go out and they more or less research the threats to your environment, what they are, how they operate, what kind of tools they use, or what kind of traces they might leave behind. They kind of analyze that. They do the research, collect that information, analyze it, and the last one here is, you can't read it on these slides very much, but it's disseminate. That actually says direction, collection, analysis, and dissemination, I think. If I remember my own slides right, that's what it says. If I don't remember my own slides right, pretend that that's what that says. The point is they go out and they figure out all this stuff, but they don't just keep it to themselves. They feed it down to the detection mechanism. And you can see, I'm going to talk about what this is in a little bit, but they send mostly what we call indicators, right? Things that you can look for. And the detection mechanisms here, they start out by observing the things that are going on in your network. That's what I talked about in the last slide, about collecting all this data and logs and everything about what's happening. They observe what's going on in your network and they compare it to a number of things. So they, first of all, in this case, they compare it directly to indicators. They might also, you could also consider like an intrusion detection system comparing the observable bytes on the network to the signatures in its database that it knows about, but that's not actually what I'm referring to at this point. And then they create a possible alert if you see a match, and then the alert gets validated to see if it's truly an event that you care something about, because yeah, there is false positives, there's crappy intel, and there's badly written signatures and all this stuff. So the output of the detection function is validated alerts, and this is what you will sometimes see in a large organization. It'll be a SOC, probably performing the validation piece, and you might have a detection mission here that does this stuff. And they send the validated alerts out over to the response organization, where they try to first contain the problem to keep it from getting worse. They might terminate a switch port, or put in a MAC address block for something, or a firewall block, or something like that, just to buy themselves some time to do this investigation, where they pull in all this data that we talked about that you collect from all over your environment. And they figure out what really happened, what the timeline of the events were, and things like that. And then they do the remediation. In other words, they fix it. That's just a fancy word called fix. Put everything back the way it's supposed to be and get it into production use again. And this is important, this is actually what makes this a cycle. It doesn't end when the response ends. It's quite likely during your investigation that you will find additional activity. So you get an alert on one piece of the entire attack, and during the investigation you can uncover much of the rest of the attack, hopefully all of it. And you might actually have more intelligence or more indicators that you uncover. So you're collecting all this data about the actual security incident, and you send that data back up to the intelligence people, and they turn it into more indicators and more intel. And just by the way, everything in here has a two-way communication. So if you trace the cycle backwards, you'll see that when the response people are doing some incident response, and to a certain extent when these guys here are validating alerts, they actually want to know context data from the intelligence people, like why did this indicator make it into the indicator database? What am I supposed to be looking for that's associated with this indicator? Like if you think that this is an indicator of some data leaving my network by an actor that you're tracking, they have some habits that that they do over and over again. What are some of those habits that I should be maybe looking for as clues about what other things went on in my network? So the context here flows back down. And of course, quality feedback flows too. So the response organization could possibly say, you're sending me too many, quote, validated alerts that were really junk. Or maybe, yeah, your alerts were accurate, but there's some other things that we consistently keep finding that you're not alerting on that you might want to consider adding to your detection plan. And of course, falling back, the detection operation can tell the same things to the intel organizations, like, hey, guys, this indicator, too many false positives, or too much junk alert, right? So let's talk about what we mean when I say intelligence. Most people, many people anyway, confuse data with intelligence. They say, well, I have got a list of indicators. I got a list of domain names. Like the FBI gave me a list of domain names in this flash. So I have some intelligence. No, you don't. You have data. You're using that term intelligence incorrectly. It's a little bit more than just knowing a fact. Intelligence does not just mean I know some things to look for. It really means, and he'll tell you this himself. He will tell you this. It's not just data. It really starts out with data, but then as you can see, you turn this data into facts. Like you have the whole list of everything that happened in your incident response, for example. And you cull it down till you find the key facts that matter. There might be 3,000 log entries, but there's only 6 that you really need to care about, and the rest of them follow on from those 6. So you distill it down into a certain set of key facts, and then you have an expert who goes and analyzes that data and says, hey, all this data and all these facts that I've gathered out of it, which ones are the important things? Also, which things are actually good indicators of the actual malicious traffic versus which are just side effects that are not really going to be well oriented for detection. So for example, you get a bunch of malware families that you can see. Well, you can generate indicators from malware families. And if you get enough samples of that malware family, suddenly you'll see common things, common domain names that keep popping up, for examples. I like to use that example because it's really easy to understand. Some pieces of malware do connectivity checking before they try to make their malicious calls. And they'll call out to google.com. I've seen ones that call out to like hp.com and other places that are really highly unlikely to ever be down on the internet, right? Without the expert analysis, if you just have a machine system that's kind of naively going through it and saying, well, I got 5 samples and they all went to google.com. Google.com must be a great indicator for this piece of malware. Anybody think that that's probably true? All the people that laugh are the people that get the FBI bulletins. We used to get these. They are also a great example. We used to get these that say, look for outbound traffic from your networks to AOL.com. Yeah, for if you're like in the military and you're on a base that has very restrictive policies about what you can do, AOL.com probably does not fall into this category, and it's a good indicator for you. It may not be a good indicator for a Fortune 5 company. They also say the same thing about, hey, why don't you just block everything that goes out to China or Eastern Europe? Again, expert analysis in your organization will probably tell you, no, that is not a good thing to do. If it's going out to Russia, that is not an indicator of anything other than you might be doing business in Russia because you have an office in Russia. You are probably doing business. So I feel like I'm continually using terms and then coming back and defining them, which is probably true. It's an indicator just is something that just points to a conclusion. It doesn't say that a conclusion is 100% sure, validated, vetted, and ready to be acted upon. An indicator is just like a piece of data that says, you know what, I saw that. I work for Mandiant and FireEye, of course, so we name all of our actors by numbers. I saw that with APT1. That doesn't mean it's actually APT1, right? It just means you saw that with APT1. Another thing, by the way, I get this a lot, and it's kind of tangential to the flow here, but indicators, signatures are not indicators. I've seen people try to put like snort signatures in their indicator database. Doesn't cut it with me. Signatures are the instantiation of a way that you detect an indicator, maybe. Right? An indicator is just something that is kind of amorphous until you bring it down into a detection platform or some place where you can do the comparison. And of course, whatever mechanism you use to do that comparison against your indicators has to have it expressed in a way. And a lot of times we refer to those as signatures. And sometimes they're very direct. They just say, hey, if you see this IP address or whatever, that's a very simple signature. Some of them are more complicated. You turn the intelligence about the protocol that the malware uses into a signature that has multiple checks that all have to validate. So as in a complex snort rule or something like that. But an indicator is not a signature, so don't treat them as though they are the same. But speaking of treating things as though they are the same, well, you've got a whole bunch of indicators now. So great, you know what intelligence is, and you know what an indicator is, but you have a whole bunch of them. Are they all equally useful? Well, first, let's see what useful is. My definition of useful in this case encompasses not only do I want to put this out and if I see it, is it bad, but my definition of useful also encompasses the fact that I have limited resources, even if that resource is just my time. But it might also be the data that I'm inspecting, that I'm able to get access to inspect, the platforms that I have out there to actually do the comparisons. I want to make sure that when I put something out there, I'm going to get the most value for it. And what I consider value is the adversaries, when they break into my network, they cause me to go through a lot of effort. I want to bring that effort back to them. I want to cause them, when they break into my network, I want to cause them a lot of effort. When you quickly detect, respond to, and disrupt adversary activity, you make it very difficult for them to operate against you. If you do that once, awesome, great. But if you can do that every time, or at least most of the time, that adversary is going to be really hard-pressed to justify spending the time, money, personnel, whatever they have to spend to operate against you. They really need to want it at that point. It is actually possible to structure, and this is what I was talking about earlier, to structure your detection and response capabilities in such a way that you turn them back onto the adversary. Our Mandiant MTrends report, I think, says something like 240 whatever odd days is the average time between detection of an incident, or the incident and the detection of the incident. That is not becoming an offensive weapon. That's like very after the fact. What we're talking about now is using that intelligence effectively, using your detection program effectively, having people that can respond to it effectively, so that you can come in within a very short amount of time and totally just disrupt whatever the adversary had in mind for that night. To give you an example, when I started working for this Fortune 5 company, we didn't have a global CERT. So we were building one from scratch, and we were actually in the corporate headquarters talking to the CIO. And we had described all of our plans, and we said, and he said, that sounds great, except there's this one thing. You've been saying so far that you're going to alert, and then you're going to do your whole investigation and make sure that you have all of the things that you know that happened. And then you're going to do what I call the rolling thunder. You just do a mass remediation. It's like you don't do anything until you're sure you know everything, and then whoosh, roll through it and hope that you catch them by surprise and fix everything at one time. And he said, I don't like that. When you see something that's compromised, I want you to have it contained within 1 hour, 24/7. Christmas morning, Thanksgiving, Saturday night, Friday night at 4:45 p.m., 1 hour. We were like, oh, dang it. Well, we didn't say that to his face, of course. This is the CIO of a Fortune 5 company. But we got kind of around the corner from his office, and we're like, oh, what are we going to do? But it turned out, actually, that was a genius move on his part to really challenge us to do that. It took us a couple years to be able to get to there. But I think, I haven't been there in about a year, but I think that's actually still one of the policies that they follow. But it worked out really well for us because it allowed us to use our intelligence, our detection, and our response. We had that 1 hour window that was across the company that everybody eventually knew and bought into. They bought into it so much that there was one night where there was a building it was in another country, if I remember correctly, but they said, I can't get somebody in there in the incident response team within an hour. I'm just going to cut power to the building that's contained. They were so serious. They were just like, just cut the power. But hey, they met their 1 hour window. We took it seriously. But in order to support that, you have to know what is important to alert on, because you can't just alert on everything and have everything be a 1 hour drill. So I came up with this kind of thing called the pyramid of pain. It doesn't cover everything that you can possibly do with detection. It covers how well you're using the threat intelligence piece for detection. So in other words, it's not necessarily like if you have a signature feed from your antivirus vendor, this is not really applicable here so much. But it covers the intelligence piece, where you're getting your intelligence from, if you generate it yourself, you're getting feeds from external sources or something like that. And you can see, I mean, it has a bunch of different types of intelligence that you might have, and we'll go through all of those in detail. And it tells you, based on potential usefulness of how much pain does it bring to the adversary when you find a piece of intel that falls at that level and detect to it and respond to it quickly. It also kind of, almost coincidentally, measures the difficulty of obtaining that intel in the first place, reliable, good intel. And even to a certain extent, the difficulty it takes you to operate at that level. So it's a pyramid of pain on both sides, but if you do this right, usually the pain is more on the adversary than on you, so it's economically speaking, it's a good win. The higher you go on this pyramid, the more resources your adversaries have to spend in order to do whatever it is that they're trying to do against you. So the bottom layer here, we're going to go through all these layers, and by the way, I'll tell you exactly what I mean by them, and when we have some examples or some fun facts or a story or something about to illustrate each one of those. Hashes, this is one of the weirdest things about the pyramid. Hashes are by far the highest confidence, highest fidelity indicators that you can have. If you have a piece of malicious code or a certain, to a lesser extent, a certain config file or something, but you have a hash of something that's malicious and you see that hash again pretty much ever, you can more or less 100% say, I know what this is. This is that thing I saw before. It's possible it may not be used in a malicious context. One attacker may use a password dumper tool, and then your legitimate system administrator might need to dump passwords and come back 3 months later and use the same tool because it's a public tool. But it does mean that you saw exactly what you intended to see. So they have very, very high confidence, but they're extremely susceptible to change, and that's why they're on the bottom layer of the pyramid. Hash values change all the time. A good hash value, 1 bit in a 5 megabyte file just changes the hash entirely, right? That's the purpose of the hash. Think about that 1 bit. I mean, that's a transmission error, or that is a bad sector in a hard drive, or that is, you know, an actor recompiling the tool without making any changes, recompiling it the day before he uses it against you, which is sometimes happens, often happens. And you get totally different hashes. It's the wide base of the pyramid because there are just so many of them, they change all the time. So I'm not saying don't track hashes. You probably should at least track some. If you have tools that you see over and over again, if you have some like host-based products that are able to send hash information to you, yeah, you probably should track them, but don't expect that that's going to solve your problem because they're the lowest value on the pyramid, which means pretty much that they're the least valuable of the types of indicators that you can have. And in here I just have a few samples. I mean, you can see, you know, in general you think longer is better, right? MD5, pretty much everybody see, the SHA-1 and SHA-256. SHA-256 is way longer than any of the other ones, so you think, hey, that's a better one. You know, honestly, all these are pretty much equivalent. It's really difficult to find hash collisions, even though we have seen engineered hash collisions on MD5 in malware in the past couple years, once that I know of. So the second layer is the IP addresses. Well, first of all, I kind of question the value of a lot of this because nobody worth their salt really comes like directly from their home cable modem to attack your environment, right? So this is not something that you're easily going to tie to activity. There's so many, again, there's just so many IP addresses on the internet. It's easy to get new IP addresses. You go through a Tor connection or an open proxy or a commercial VPN service or something like that, and you can just get whatever, how many IP addresses you need. Shoot, if you're a black hat, then you just break into somebody else's computer and use their IP address, rent time on a botnet or whatever. Tracking IP addresses may or may not be that useful for you. If they're hard-coded into a config file or something, it might be a little bit more useful for you because it's a little bit more difficult for the attackers to get on the computer and update the config files. But a lot of the modern malware has that kind of covered anyway, so it may not be useful. But one thing to know about it is that there's like at least 6 different ways that I know of that you can express the exact same IP address. So you can't just say, oh, dotted decimal is the only thing I'm ever going to track. Because you might get a clever attacker, especially that like I mentioned before, in a config file or something, where they're trying to hide what they're doing. So they don't want you to identify the IP address. They may not list it as dotted decimal. These are all the same IP address. And by the way, if you, like say, it's common that you might have your home router or something like that on 192.168.1.1. So if you go to your house and you type in any of these things verbatim in your web browser, they will all take you to the same place. Your web browsers all do this. And it's not the web browser, it's actually the underlying piece of the operating system, the libraries that parse that kind of stuff. So they will all work pretty much everywhere. So just beware, even though you might be slick and saying, hey, I'm tracking the dotted decimal versions of these, you might actually be seeing other things too. On the domains, kind of mid-level, they kind of have the same problem a little bit as the IP addresses in that there's just so many domains out there. They're almost as easy to change, except for IP addresses don't require registration so much. I mean, you're using somebody else's. It was registered years and years ago. But the domains actually usually require that you pre-register them and sometimes pay a fee. You can get around that with like dynamic DNS providers. So a lot of times you'll see threat actors using dynamic DNS because they can just whip up in a couple seconds a new domain. They even automate those, some of them through APIs that you can just say, hey, create me some new domains. But a lot of them that we see still are traditional, like top-level domains like bad.com or something, right? But even though they require pre-registration, there's still ways around that. So an adversary with even a moderate level of resources can just register a whole bunch of them pretty cheaply and start using them whenever they feel like it. Some of the adversaries, like the high end, they might be nation states themselves and they might actually be the registrar. So that's probably not too much of a barrier for them. So, not so much of a big deal. But there's still a couple interesting things about domains. First of all, it can be hard to make sure that you're capturing all the kinds of domains. So, especially recently with Unicode domains, these two are actually the same domain. Unicode, this is, I blame myself, even though I'd use Google Translate for this. This is an example of something like, this is like, I think bad domain or something.com, but I sent it through Google Translate to get the Unicode, Japanese Unicode version of that. But obviously, most of the people in this room probably use US English as their first language on their browser. So you're much more likely to see this domain. It means the same thing. With the international level of cybercrime, you may actually see some of these domains that is hard for you to interpret. They might not even show up correctly in your terminal, depending on your settings. So you have to kind of be aware that there's multiple ways this can show up. You'll kind of also have to be a little bit aware. I have two domains over here. One of them is a totally great domain, which I recommend everyone visit on a daily basis. And the other one, if you go there, you're probably going to cause a security incident. What's the difference? Can anybody tell me what the difference is between those two domains? You can't, can you? Here's the difference. No, but you're close. That A is the Latin A. That A is the Cyrillic A.
Oh, they're rendered by the font the same.
They're visually the same. When you are dealing with, maybe, since I use Cyrillic in this example, maybe you're dealing with an Eastern European, Russian kind of cybercrime gang or something, they may be trying to trick you. They're targeting somebody in Richmond. Yeah, sure, maybe they're sending RVAsec. But it's not RVAsec, it's RVAsec. So that's another thing you have to be a little bit aware of. Just because you see a domain doesn't mean it's the domain you see.
And just out of curiosity, any US registrars allow you to use foreign, do you know?
If the question was, can US registrars register internationalized domain names? I believe the answer is yes, but I don't actually know. I don't register that many international domain names.
Just curious.
Yeah. Now, the next level is where I think things start to get interesting. And that's the artifacts layer. Network artifacts, host-based artifacts, even log-based artifacts maybe. It's basically the traces of what they're doing. Not necessarily where they're communicating to or the exact hash of the binary they're using, but it's hard to do stuff on a network without leaving some kind of trace behind. And that trace might be a log file entry with a known bad user account, or it could be a file or directory that they use to dump their stage 2 malware download into. It could be a mutex that they use to make sure that they don't run multiple copies of their malware on your box. It could be a startup location that they write to, or something like that. Even a string in memory. So if you dump memory on the box, even if they don't write anything to the file system, you dump memory on the box, you can see the strings for the malware in there. That is an example of an artifact. On the network side, you might see a lot of malware is HTTP based, so you might see specially constructed URIs that conform to a pattern. You might see distinctive user agents or something like that. You might even see, it doesn't have to be HTTP, you might see some other protocol where they've kind of implemented their own version of it and maybe made some errors in the implementation, or they have a different interpretation of what some field values might mean than others, or they're trying to shove data into parts of an otherwise legitimate protocol, so they're making the data values look weird that you can find. So these examples of different artifacts. And I have some of those here. So like, a distinctive URI pattern, maybe looking at one piece of malware, it's hard to discover what that pattern is, but if you either do a reverse engineer of that malware, or even if you just have a whole bunch of samples of that malware with different URLs, you can start seeing some of those patterns, right? Some criminals or other attackers like to make it really easy, and they just say, hey, well, I got to put something in for a user agent. I don't know. I can't be bothered to Google some legitimate user agents. I'll just put in my own string. That's super easy. Thanks, guys. I can find that really easily. Or typos. So this is very, very similar to a legitimate Internet Explorer user agent. Who can tell me what the difference is? And it's not character set. I'm sorry. Is that true? Did I make that mistake? See, I might have made a mistake there too. What Jack is saying that this should be an uppercase C. That may be true. Actually, that was not my intent. That was not the typo I intended to show. But this goes to show how easy it is to make a typo here. Do we have another guess? No, Mozilla 5.0 is a legitimate one. Okay, there's supposed to be a space here. MSIE space 7.0. I've literally seen that exact typo in multiple samples. It is so easy. It's super easy to make a long, complex string. The next level, here's where you start bringing some real pain. The tools. if you have an extended engagement with an adversary that uses the same tool set, or sometimes if you have a common tool that is used by a lot of different adversaries, you see that tool over and over again, and you might start detecting it further down the pyramid, but at some point you get so familiar with that tool that you can use it, you can find it, no matter what minor changes they do to it. To continue past that, they either have to make major changes to that tool or possibly go out and get a new tool. But either way, you win, because if they have to make major changes to it, they kick it back to the development. They go into the source code, they make some major changes. They probably have to test it to make sure it's all working and get it deployed. And if it changes the way they use the tool at all, they have to train themselves again for it. If they have to get a new tool, they have to go and find one or ask for one to be built for them, custom, and then again, training and getting up to speed with it. It's painful. They could do it once, they'd probably do it once or twice, but if they do it a lot, then that's a problem for them. The story I have to tell here is really cool. One of the places that I used to work, we followed a particular adversary really heavily for a couple of years. And they used the same tool over and over on us. They were used to victim organizations that kind of topped out at the artifact layer, because they had this tool that was designed to defeat artifact level. They had the back end, what had all the functionality of the tool, was invariant, never changed. And the front end was just a bolt-on front end that did all the network communications filtered through there. So they could change the entire protocol that the tool spoke at a drop of a hat. So we saw it, the first few times we saw it, it was just like, we actually started alerting based on domain names or something. But we found the tool and we were like, oh, well, we see these URLs, we can make regular expressions to match those and shove them into our IDSs. Great, we found that tool. And so they said, hey, whatever, I got this bolt-on, you think you're so great, let's change the way I make the URLs. So we found that again, working on indicators a little bit lower down in the tool stack. We found that again, and they had just changed the way they made the pattern, so we updated our pattern, and they were like, okay, Mr. Smarty Pants, we're going to go to SSL. And I was like, okay, what are we going to do, guys? But we popped open that SSL certificate, and again, it was one of these things where they had made a typo. And so it was a very simple typo, but we found that typo, and anytime we found that typo, we found their tool. And then they were like, well, okay, this is not working out so well for us. Let's change to FTP. Yeah, we found that too. And about that time, the reason we found the FTP one was because at the time that we started working around the SSL piece, we noticed that the front end was changing, but once they got the network communications up and running, the network stream was pretty much identical, and they had a keep alive that we could find. It was been the part of the code that was hard for them to change, not the part that was easy for them to change. We found them using that FTP thing, and one night in the middle of the night, hey, we got an alert, and we were like, I know what to do here. We detected them, we responded to them within the hour, disrupted them in the middle of what they were doing. I can't speak for what was going on in their head, but I saw them fall back to their initial command and control and start looking around, looking at like what administrators were on the box, looking at their stuff. We were on the network, so we were invisible to them at that time, and freak out and log out. And really, that was the last time we ever saw them. So I can't, like I said, I can't speak to what was going on their minds, but I think it's pretty likely that we pushed them up kind of high in the pyramid. They got stuck on the pointy top there, and they didn't want to come back. Speaking of the pointy top, tactics, techniques, and procedures. You'll see this, people talk about this as this one monolithic thing, the TTPs. And most people can't even tell you what the actual T's are. Tools, techniques, and procedures, or whatever. No, it's tactics, techniques, and procedures. That's the expression of the attacker's training and experience. That is, retraining how to do tasks that you know how to do is really difficult. They say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You can, but it's very, very painful if your old dog is an attacker. They're going to resist. Nobody wants to learn new ways to do all the commands they've been using for 10 years. Yes?
And gain outside those methods, that comfort space.
So the question is, do they have a doctrine that they're things that they're comfortable using, and if you push them out of there, does it hurt them? Yeah, it really does. And you can see, retraining is the hardest thing to do. So if you can do that one time to them, it hurts them. If you keep doing that to them, they pretty much have to question their real commitment to operating in your environment. And even if you don't actually kick them out, you're causing them to expend much more resources against you. That's fewer things they can actually do to you successfully. Is still a win for you. So, I mentioned that these three things are separate. So my extra data here is a little bit of an example of how they are separate. So a tactic is more like, for data staging, would be like, oh, I'm going to create an encrypted raw file and then transfer it over the network to an exfiltration point. But when it comes, and somebody high level will say, like an architect of an attack, they'll say, like, this is what you're going to do. But then when it comes down to the techniques, so you'd be like, well, it's an encrypted raw file. Well, we're going to use AES encryption, right? And we're going to create file, but we're going to create files of exactly so many bytes, or they're going to have this particular extension and file name, whatever. And then we're going to do those file copies via SMB. That's how we're going to do them. And then somebody will come down and write down the actual commands. And maybe this doesn't all happen every time the exact same way, but they will develop the procedure that you could theoretically give to like an entry-level person and be like, type these commands. Here's the procedure. You type winrar a-hp QWERTY, which sets up the password and the strongly encrypted stuff, and here's the file name you're going to do, and then here's your making that share so that you're going to transfer it, copy things across into that share, which is an SMB transfer. So that's the difference. Data staging is, I'm going to create an encrypted RAR file. That's the tactic. The technique is, I'm going to use AES encryption, and the procedure is, hey, winrar a-hp QWERTY. Even though I will admit, I'm also often guilty of saying TTPs are only one thing. So I am coming to the end of my presentation, which is good, because I have my collection of 3 favorite GIFs. Summary. First of all, typical things that you see, the wacky wall walker, throw it against the wall approach. Don't do that. There is a better way. Also, this guy is not your intelligence, right? And then here's the pyramid. When you get your intelligence, don't do this, do this. For all you people on the video, I'm circling, sorry. When you get your intelligence, don't throw it against the wall. Compare it to the pyramid and see where it falls, and then make some decisions about what you want to have where. And I'm going to stop now. I'll put my contact information up here. And I will say, I'll have a minute for questions, I think. Do I have a minute for questions? Yes? Okay, good. Okay. Oh, I have 10? I thought I was, okay, awesome. Before I get into the questions, though, I just wanted to mention, I saw a few people taking pictures of the slides. So if you want one of these, I have the actual Pyramid of Pain on the business cards here, and they have a handy QR code that is totally, totally safe. That'll go to my blog post that explains the pyramid itself in more detail. So you feel free to either come up after or hit me up during the conference, and I will be happy to provide you one.